Hello and welcome, gorgeous souls. This is Rochelle, and you are at the DIY Affiliate and Collectives Soul Journey. In this video, we are talking about June 3rd, 2024. The planets are aligning and what type of influence this will have on your twin flame journey. Science versus belief. I am talking about two opposing energy forces of astrology and astronomy. What are the planetary influences of June 3rd, 2024, when the 6 planets will be in alignment with each other and seen from the Earth? To begin with, we will first look at the differences between astronomy versus astrology to get a clearer picture of both. Astronomy is based on scientific observation and experimentation, while astrology is based on interpretations and beliefs. Astrology is a belief system that assigns meanings and influences on celestial objects, particularly the planets and the zodiac signs. On June 3rd, 2024, just right before dawn, there will be a planetary alignment visible in the sky. This will not be a perfect alignment where all the planets are perfectly lined up in a row, but they will be close enough together in the sky to be seen with a naked eye or with a telescope, depending on the planet. In astrology, planets are believed to hold specific meanings and influence personality traits, life events, and compatibility between people. The position of the planets relative to each other and the zodiac at the time of birth, which is the natal chart, is thought to be significant in numerology. Astrology is also used with numerology, as time is relative as well, and the letters of the names of the planets also carry a numerical vibrational energy, a unique frequency that they are transmitting. Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with the twin flame journey? Astronomy is mostly science-based in the 3D physical world, and anything that cannot be proven scientifically is not real and should not be believed. Science looks at the planet influences that can only be proven by a scientist and then put out publicly in a fact-based way. In science, it is gravity, and that planets have a gravitational pull on each other, including our Earth. This pulling energy is what keeps planets in their orbits around the sun. Science recognizes the pull on the sides. The combined gravitational forces of the sun and the moon cause the oceans to rise and bulge on the side closest to them and on the side furthest away, creating high and low tides. Science recognizes the gravitational pull of the Earth, which is enveloped in the physical law of universal gravitation. The law that governs the moon's pull on Earth and all gravitational interactions that have mass and matter is Isaac Newton's law of universal gravitation. This law states that every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportionate to the square of the distance between their centers. The moon has mass and the Earth has mass. Because of that, they attract each other according to the law of gravitation. This mutual attraction is what we perceive as the moon's pull on Earth. So even if we are looking at science-based information, this still relies heavily on our perception and the law of attraction. Our perception is our reality. It does not matter what lens you are looking out from. It is only what you can perceive is the reality that you will live. In other words, if you cannot perceive a reality you desire, you will live in the reality that you can perceive of. Astronomy studies the physical properties and behavior of celestial bodies, while astrology focuses on their influence on human lives and relationships. That being said, the other planets such as Mars, Venus, or Neptune, to name a few, are not recognized as having any effect on the Earth, and therefore have no effect on the twin flame journey, because the idea of the twin flame journey is a belief, so therefore not scientifically proven at this time. This is what science says, but it is what you believe in your heart to be the reality that you have manifested, either for you as an individual soul on a soul journey, or you as a twin flame on a soul journey together. So I have put together the possible influences that these planets can have on your twin flame journey, or you as an awakening soul energy. These planets themselves, which fall under the umbrella of astrology, have been assigned certain aspects and characteristics, or energy influences. This is the energetic influences that they may have on a twin flame journey, especially when there are 6 planets in alignment. Now, we are talking about energies. And this is the subtle energies that we are creating through the chakras and the subtle energy body system, which is through the auric field, or our aura. Remember, everything is energy. Our thoughts, which are intentions, our emotions, and our actions, according to a number of the laws that govern universal energy. What you think is subjective to the perception of the reality you are creating when in the flow state of health, wealth, abundance, increase, and soul expansion. We are influenced by energies, and when certain planets can be seen from Earth, this gives another layer to the density of their influences on our life. One thing to keep in mind is that not everyone is on a twin flame journey, but we still are influenced by the planets and astrology and numerology in the same way. The difference is, as a twin, you are experiencing this energy at the same time as your twin. Remember, you are 2 halves of a whole incarnated on this earth as 2 individual souls. You may not even have met your twin yet. Now, the sun is considered the center of the solar system in astrology. This is symbolizing vitality, ego, and life force. It represents the core energy that drives the twin flame connection, the sense of wholeness or completeness experienced in the union of a twin flame relationship. The moon, even though it is not a planet, is associated with emotions, intuition, and the subconscious mind. It symbolizes the deep emotional connection and intuitive understanding between twin flames. Earth itself is not assigned a specific planetary influence. The focus is more on how other planets' positions relative to Earth and the zodiac at birth might influence a person. However, some astrologers consider that traditionally Earth was seen as the center of the universe in astrology. Perspective has shifted, but some astrologers might still view Earth's placement in a natal chart or birth chart as symbolic of a person's sense of self, grounding, and connection to the physical world. In a way, the sun is considered Earth's guiding light in astrology. The sun's position in a natal chart is associated with a person's core identity, vitality, and life purpose. On June 3rd, 2024, there will be a planetary alignment. This will be visible in the pre-dawn sky. Here are the planets that are involved in the planetary alignment. The first planet is Mercury. Mercury will be visible low in the eastern horizon just before sunrise. You might need a clear view and a good horizon to spot it. Mercury is linked with communication, intellect, and learning. This represents the ease of communication, meeting of minds, or a strong mental connection between you and your twin or soulmate. The next planet is Mars. Mars will be higher in the eastern sky than Mercury and should be easier to see. Mars is linked with passion, drive, and action. It could symbolize the intense passion and desire often described between twins, or the drive to overcome challenges and obstacles together. Next is Jupiter. The giant of our solar system will be the brightest object in the pre-dawn sky and will be difficult to miss. Jupiter is associated with growth, optimism, abundance, and expansion. It might symbolize the personal growth and spiritual development that can happen through the twin flame connection. It could also represent the abundance of love and joy experienced by you and your twin together. Look to the left of Jupiter, closer to the horizon, to find Saturn. It will be fainter than Jupiter, but still visible. Saturn is linked with responsibility, commitment, overcoming limitations, and karma. It could symbolize the challenges and karma that twin flames are said to face together. It might also represent the commitment and maturity needed for a lasting twin flame relationship. Uranus will be much fainter than the other planets and will require a telescope to see it. It will be located between Mars and Saturn. Uranus is associated with rebellion, change, innovation, and awakening. It could represent the unconventional nature of the twin flame connection, or the awakening and positive changes that can occur through this relationship. Even with a telescope, Neptune will be incredibly challenging to spot during this alignment. It'll be located near Saturn. Neptune is linked with dreams, ideals, intuition, and illusion. Neptune could represent the idealistic and spiritual nature of the twin flame connection, or the need to be cautious about idealizing the relationship. Pluto, this planet is not included in the planetary alignment on June 3rd, but Pluto is associated with transformation, power, and deep subconscious drives. Within the twin flame journey, this can symbolize the transformation power of the twin flame connection, or the deep emotional intensity that can be experienced. Venus is also not mentioned in the planetary alignment. Venus is often called the love planet and is linked to romantic love, attraction, and desire. People with strong Venus placements in their natal charts, their birth charts, might be seen as affectionate, charming, and drawn to beauty. It could also influence the romantic aspects of the twin flame journey. This story is meant to give you the knowledge of what each planet's influence is on the twin flame journey and our soul journey as a collective of like-minded souls awakening together. Here are a couple of tips for watching this wonderful celestial event that I found online. The best time to look for the planetary alignment will be around 30 to 40 minutes before sunrise on June 3rd. Overall, the June 3rd planetary alignment is a fantastic opportunity to see multiple planets at once. With a little planning and effort, you should be able to enjoy this celestial event together with your twin flame or your soulmate and family. Thank you for being a loyal subscriber, and please leave me a comment so that I can follow that comment back to your channel and check out some of your videos, and subscribe to your channel to help you to grow online. Have a wonderful evening, and see you in the next video.